All right, so we're now to our final video. And as I mentioned in the first video, we've been working our way to the last developed part of the brain. And so that's the cerebral cortex. And you see we've got all of our subcortical structures are still in here. And now we've developed outwards to the cortex, and we are talking about the telencephalon still. So the last video we talked about the limbic system and the basal ganglia, which are both still a part of the telencephalon, but subcortical. So we can now complete our brain model. So we now have the completed brain. We see the brain stem goes up into the midbrain, and then is surrounded by the cerebral cortex, which is a little harder to make than you would think. Anyways, let's look at an MRI. So I'm not really going to point out anything specific on here, but well, maybe I will. So it's easy to see the cortex when we look at an MRI here. And the cortex, it literally means bark. So the cerebral cortex is approximately 3 millimeters thick, and it surrounds the cerebral hemispheres like the bark of a tree. And corrected for brain or for body size, the cerebral cortex is larger in humans than any other species. And the brain is divided into two hemispheres, to the left and right hemisphere. And each hemisphere is in charge of the opposite side of the body, which is interesting. So your right hand or your right brain controls your left hand, and the right hemisphere also takes in sensory input from your left side and vice versa. So that's kind of complicated or confusing, but a fun fact. And although these hemispheres cooperate and communicate, they don't perform identical functions. So some functions are lateralized, meaning like specialized to one hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is particularly good at recognizing serial events and controlling or specializing for controlling sequences of behavior. And the right hemisphere is more specialized for synthesis, and is particularly good at putting sort of isolated elements together to perceive things as a whole. And so these are connected by the corpus callosum, which is down the middle. It's maybe not the best view of it. I don't think I pulled up a better image. But yeah, the corpus callosum is a large band of axons that connect, they connect the hemispheres and corresponding parts of the cerebral cortex of the left and right hemispheres. So because of this structure, this large band of axons, each region of the association cortex knows what is happening in the corresponding region of the opposite side of the brain, because things are confusing in the brain. But anyways, back to the cortex. In humans, the cerebral cortex is greatly convoluted. So as you can see, all of these bumps and whatnot, and these bumps have names. So these convolutions consist of sulci, which are small grooves, and fissures, which are large grooves, and gyri, which are bulges between adjacent sulci or fissures, like that. And these greatly enlarge the surface of the cortex. Like if you were to imagine all of this stretched out, it becomes a lot more cortex. And so compared to a smooth brain, you have a lot more surface area. And in fact, 2/3 of the surface of the cortex is hidden in the grooves. So the presence of these convolutions triples the area of the cerebral cortex, which is pretty cool. So yeah, the cortex is divided into 4 areas, which are called lobes, and they're named for the bones of the skull that they cover. And there's 2 of each lobe based on the hemispheres, one in each hemisphere. And the frontal lobe, I'm actually going to pull up one more image. So this is, this is from the textbook, but I like the image. And so the frontal lobe is very important for executive functions. And it includes everything in front of the central sulcus. So the central sulcus, I feel like it would be on here. Maybe it doesn't show here, central sulcus. Yeah, so everything in front of this, it makes an easy delineation between the frontal and then the parietal lobes. So yeah, the frontal lobes manage skills known as executive functions, and these are very important skills we use for things like problem solving, planning, making decisions, controlling our behavior. Yeah, and also the frontal lobe plays a central role in our personality. So then the parietal lobe over here is located on the side of the cerebral hemisphere, and just behind the central sulcus, so caudal to the frontal lobe. And one of their main functions is to allow us to make sense of things we touch, and motor related things, sensory motor. So for example, whether an object is smooth or sharp. And then the parietal lobes also tell us where our body is in relation to the objects around us. This allows us to move around without bumping into things. And they also are important for skills such as math, spelling, hand-eye coordination, and fine motor movements. So yeah, I always want to say like, oh, this is very important, but everything in the brain is very important. So maybe not necessary to say. And then the temporal lobe is just kind of above the ears and juts forward from the base of the brain, ventral to the frontal and parietal lobes. And one of their important functions is to help us process and understand sounds such as musical notes and speech. Other functions include managing our emotions and recognizing faces. And last but not least, the occipital lobe in the back And the occipital lobe is important for its role in vision because they allow us to make sense of information that comes from our eyes. And so each primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex sends information to adjacent regions called the sensory association cortex. So circuits of neurons in the sensory association cortex analyze the information received from the primary sensory cortex. Perception takes place there and memories are stored there. So the association cortices include most of the cerebral surface of the human brain. See this association cortex here for auditory and visual, somatosensory, and they're largely responsible for the complex processing that goes on between the arrival of input in the primary sensory cortices and the generation of behavior. And then the cingulate gyrus is limbic cortex, which we see down here. And it's an arch-shaped convolution just situated just above the corpus callosum. And it's involved in processing emotions and behavior regulation, which makes sense being limbic cortex, if you remember the functions of the limbic system that we talked about in our last video. And I also want to touch briefly on the ventricles and the production of cerebral spinal fluid and the layers that protect our brain. So I didn't mention it really earlier, but the ventricles, lateral ventricles are here. So they're the first and second. And then there's a third and fourth ventricle. I'm always sad taking the brain apart because it takes a long time to put together. But you can see the fourth ventricle coming out in the bottom. And let's look at them on the screen as well. We can see the the lateral ventricles here, so the first and second, and then the third, and the fourth you can't really see, but it would be down here. And they're connected by the what's called the cerebral aqueduct, which is like a small tube connecting the fluid. And so the ventricles are hollow spaces within the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and they are really important for playing a role in creating cerebrospinal fluid. And these fluid-filled structures called the ventricles lie deep inside the brain. And having these fluid-filled ventricles helps to keep the brain buoyant and cushioned, as well as plays a role in removal of things like CSF. And the CSF is produced specifically by the choroid plexus, which is a highly vascular tissue, which is rich in blood content, and it protrudes into the ventricles. And injury to parts of the brain or head, neck, back injuries can produce cerebrospinal fluid that seeps out of the ventricles into dangerous areas. And yeah, I was a lifeguard for a period in time, and I remember one of the signs that was like, uh-oh, this is bad, was if somebody had cerebrospinal fluid coming out of their ear or something like that after hitting their head in the sand. And yeah, I guess I also just wanted to talk about the meninges. And so these are the layers that help protect the brain. And so there's 3 layers of tissue that encase the central nervous system. It's maybe not super easy to tell just from an MRI like this, but there's the dura mater, which is tough and flexible and is the outermost layer. And then there's the arachnoid membrane, which is the middle layer. And below that is the pia mater, which is a layer that clings to the surface of the brain, and that's very thin and delicate. But between the pia mater and the arachnoid membrane is the subarachnoid space. I would believe it's this. I'm not 100% sure. Or maybe it's this. And the subarachnoid space is located, well, between the arachnoid and pia mater, but it is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid that like cushions the brain. So yeah, that's the end of this video series. I hope it was enjoyable and you learned something.